Town, The Life of a Bahamian Hero, the biographical memoir of my father, Basil Johnson, CBE, DFM. And in keeping with this month's World War II theme at the Society, I think that's right, Andre?
Yeah.
World War II. Yeah. Okay. I'll just change my glasses. It's easier to see with these. I trust that my contribution this evening will bring new information to the reservoir of Bahamian history, particularly around World War II events and our country's participation. There's a resurgence of interest in World War II in Britain and the Commonwealth as our generation moves up in age and grows curious about the history of our parents. Indeed, I'm informed that the BBC very recently aired a new documentary, Fighting for King and Empire, Britain's Caribbean Heroes. For it's only been in the last 15 to 20 years that Britain has tangibly acknowledged the contribution of the Commonwealth to the World War II victory, and in particular the Caribbean. There are a number of memorials, in fact, that have gone up in London over the last 10, 15 years, started by an English lady of Indian origin who was in a train station and was bumped by, I suppose you would call them a native Briton, and told to go back where she came from. And her father, in fact, had fought for Britain in World Wars I and II. And she thought it was time that she started to memorialize the contribution so that others would appreciate and know that the colonies also made their contribution. In writing this memoir, I ticked 2 items on my bucket list. Firstly, the promise that I made to my father in his final days that I would write his proud story that he believed was worthy of the telling. And secondly, being a child and student of the 50s and 60s in this country, there was a strong impetus that one needed to contribute to our nation building as our nation rapidly progressed from a sleepy colonial backwater to majority rule and independence. I always believed that my contribution as a lover of reading and English literature was as a writer. And of course, as a writer, you have to have someone or something to write about. Hence, my father provided the fodder and the content and the context, and the 2 ambitions dovetailed into one. In this, in this lecture, I will first speak generally of how I came to write and produce the book before more closely examining the writing itself, the contents of the book. When I promised my father that I would write his story, I thought I would produce a 50 to 60 page booklet. Instead, to my surprise, I ended up with a 250 page book of pretty substantial and relevant information. My original objective was A, to tell his story, and B, to set down as much of the family history that I had accumulated over the years for future Johnson Mitchells. I discovered, however, that I had a lot of material to work with, as my father had kept his notes, writings, and a collection of World War II books, including on his Squadron 156. And there were as well newspaper clippings that I cut out and just kept over the years. And so I really had a lot of material just sitting there that I was able to refer to. And then, of course, I found that I had to put him in the context of the times in which he lived, 1920 to 2004, an 84-year span in what was a period of significant and swift changes in the Bahamas and in the world. Our country grew up, as did Basil. There was a Second World War. We got over it. and welcomed in a new millennium. I also felt a sense of duty to record and to share the information that he left for our people, particularly events at the Electricity Department, the British Legion, and the adventures of him as a war hero, a Bahamian man who actually placed himself in danger and was prepared to die for the freedom of his country, which was no joke. I'll tell you a story which warmed my heart and which achieved another objective, which I hope this book would achieve. Over Christmas, one of my nieces introduced me to a friend of hers, and his surname later caused me to say to her, "Tell him his grandfather is mentioned in the book." And I gave her a page reference. She photographed the page. I showed it to him, and he was puzzled as to why his grandfather would be an executive officer in the British Legion. He inquired of his father, who confirmed that his grandfather, who was English, had been an RAF pilot in World War II, and he showed him a newspaper clipping of his grandfather's escapades. Can you imagine the knowledge of self that that young man achieved at that moment? He himself is an air traffic controller and a licensed pilot. Similarly, Patty McCollis told me that she had always heard about a Mr. Leota who did the best comforters in town in her mother's youth. And she had been, the historian in her, had been trying to find out who this Mr. Leota was. She'd gotten as far as discovering that he was Italian, but that was as far as she got. And as she read The Black Prince, of course, there is Mr. Leota with his shop on the top of Cumberland Street, married to one of the Johnson girls that also lived on Cumberland Street. So I say that to say that, you know, there's a lot of relevance for persons in this book. I also want to reference some comments that persons who've read the book have made to encourage you to be interested and perhaps to purchase a copy and read it if you haven't done so already. My brother Ivan of the Punch Infamy, he's in fact here this evening, said, he would have loved this book. You have done him proud. He must be smiling down on you from that great RAF base in the sky. Dr. Ted Turnquest said, it's interesting because it has a sense of adventure, of a man progressing himself. Octavia Johnson, an aunt, said, it is real. No one else but you could have written this. A Mr. Forbes said to me, this is a book about a man when men were men. John Wanklin, a historian in his own right, wrote me 2 letters on the book, pointing out a few things that he thought, he wasn't sure whether they were correct or not. But he referred to my extraordinary father and said that the book gave interesting insight into the political and social history of the Bahamas. Paul Arana, who is also here this evening, in his column a few weeks ago, called it an interesting read, for it includes so much of our Bahamian history during the lifetime of the author's father. Eminent attorney Sean McQueenie, QC, sent me an email. He described it as a splendid piece of writing. I enjoyed it immensely. It was as educational as it was entertaining. You have done your father proud. It brings to life a complex man of consequence with an extraordinary and interesting personality whose dedication to his family and country was nothing short of inspirational. Sharon Poitier, a former student